World War II was the deadliest and most widespread conflict in human history. It lasted from 1939 to 1945 and involved more than 30 countries across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. To understand how the world descended into such massive destruction, we must first look at the political, economic, and social conditions that led to the war. The aftermath of World War I. The roots of World War II lie deeply in the unresolved consequences of World War I. When the First World War ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted and broken. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war, but planted the seeds for another conflict. Germany, blamed for starting World War I, was forced to accept full responsibility. It lost territory, was limited in military power, and had to pay heavy reparations. These punishments humiliated Germany and shattered its economy. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment rose, and poverty became widespread. Many Germans felt betrayed by their leaders and angry at the international community. This anger created fertile ground for extremist political movements. Rise of Adolf Hitler and Nazism. In the early 1920s, a man named Adolf Hitler began to gain attention in Germany. He was a powerful speaker who promised to restore German pride, rebuild the economy, and undo the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler joined the National Socialist German Workers' Party, commonly known as the Nazi Party. By exploiting fear, nationalism, and economic hardship, Hitler gained massive public support. He blamed Germany's problems on Jews, communists, and other minorities, spreading hatred and propaganda. In 1933, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Soon after, he dismantled democracy, eliminated political opponents, and declared himself Führer or supreme leader. Under Hitler's rule, Germany became a totalitarian state. The Nazis controlled the media, education, and society. Jews were stripped of rights, businesses were destroyed, and violence against them increased. At the same time, Hitler secretly began rebuilding Germany's military, directly violating the Treaty of Versailles. Fascism in Italy and militarism in Japan. Germany was not alone in its aggressive ambitions. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist dictatorship in the 1920s. Mussolini dreamed of reviving the glory of the ancient Roman Empire. He invaded Ethiopia in 1935, showing the world that international laws were weak and easily ignored. In Asia, Japan was becoming a powerful military nation. Facing limited natural resources, Japanese leaders believed expansion was necessary for survival. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria in China and later launched a full-scale war against China in 1937. Japanese forces committed brutal war crimes, including the infamous Nanjing Massacre. These actions demonstrated that aggression was going unpunished. The League of Nations, created to maintain peace after World War I, failed to stop these invasions. This failure encouraged even greater aggression. Hitler's expansion in Europe. Hitler's foreign policy was based on expansion or Lebensraum, meaning living space, for the German people. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone. Britain and France protested but took no action. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in an event known as the Anschluss. Again, no military response followed. Later that year, Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a German-speaking population. At the Munich Conference, Britain and France agreed to Hitler's demands in hopes of avoiding war. This policy became known as appeasement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously declared he had achieved peace for our time. However, Hitler had no intention of stopping. In March 1939, Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, proving appeasement had failed. The Nazi-Soviet Pact. As Europe grew increasingly tense, Hitler made a shocking move. In August 1939, Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it included a secret agreement to divide Eastern Europe between the two powers. This pact stunned the world. Nazi Germany and the Communist Soviet Union were ideological enemies, yet they agreed not to fight each other. The agreement cleared the final obstacle for Hitler's next move, invading Poland. The invasion of Poland. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland using a new military strategy called Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War. This tactic combined fast-moving tanks, aircraft, and infantry to overwhelm the enemy quickly. Poland was unable to defend itself against the powerful German attack. Just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east, as agreed in the secret pact. Poland was crushed and divided between Germany and the USSR. In response, Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. World War II had officially begun. A world on the brink. Although war had been declared, the early months saw little fighting in Western Europe. This period became known as the Phony War. However, beneath the surface, the world was preparing for a conflict unlike any before. Nations mobilized their industries, economies, and populations. Civilians would soon become targets, cities would be destroyed, and millions of lives would be lost. The stage was set for a global struggle that would reshape the world forever. In Part 2, the war will explode across Europe as Germany launches devastating invasions, and the true horror of modern warfare begins. By the end of 1939, Europe was officially at war, but few people truly understood how fast and how violently the conflict would unfold. What followed in 1940 was a series of lightning-fast invasions that shocked the world and proved that modern warfare had entered a terrifying new era. The Phony War ends. After the invasion of Poland, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Yet for several months, there was little fighting on the Western Front. This strange period became known as the Phony War. Soldiers waited in trenches. Civilians listened to radio broadcasts, and governments prepared for the storm they knew was coming. Behind the scenes, Adolf Hitler was planning something unprecedented. Instead of attacking France head-on through its heavily fortified Maginot Line, German generals designed a bold and risky strategy. They would strike through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed was impassable to tanks. This decision would change the course of the war. Invasion of Denmark and Norway. In April 1940, Germany made its next move by invading Denmark and Norway. Denmark fell within hours, overwhelmed by German forces. Norway resisted longer, but German control of key ports and airfields eventually led to its defeat. The invasion of Norway gave Germany access to vital iron ore supplies from Sweden and important naval bases in the North Atlantic. It also demonstrated how air power, naval forces, and ground troops could work together in a coordinated attack. Blitzkrieg in the West. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched a massive offensive against Western Europe. German troops invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. As expected, Allied forces rushed north to defend Belgium, believing this would be the main German attack. But the real strike came through the Ardennes. German tanks pushed rapidly through the forest, crossed the Meuse River, and broke through French defenses. The speed and coordination of the Blitzkrieg shocked Allied commanders. Communication lines collapsed, and entire armies were outmaneuvered. Within days, German forces reached the English Channel, cutting off hundreds of thousands of British and French troops in northern France and Belgium. The miracle of Dunkirk. By late May 1940, Allied soldiers were trapped near the French port of Dunkirk. Surrounded by German forces, defeat seemed inevitable. However, in one of the most dramatic moments of the war, a massive evacuation was launched. Operation Dynamo began on May 26, 1940. Warships, merchant vessels, fishing boats, and even private civilian boats crossed the channel under constant enemy fire. Over 9 days, more than 330,000 Allied soldiers were rescued and brought safely to Britain. Although the evacuation was a military retreat, it became a powerful symbol of courage and unity. The rescued soldiers would later play a crucial role in continuing the fight against Nazi Germany. The fall of France. Despite the success at Dunkirk, France could not recover. German forces continued their advance southward. Paris was declared an open city, and fell to the Germans on June 14, 1940. On June 22, France officially surrendered. The country was divided into two zones: the northern region occupied by Germany and the southern area controlled by the Vichy government, which collaborated with the Nazis. The fall of France stunned the world. A nation considered one of Europe's strongest military powers had collapsed in just 6 weeks. Britain now stood alone against Nazi Germany. Britain stands alone. With France defeated, Hitler turned his attention to Britain. He believed that if Britain could be crushed or forced to surrender, Germany would dominate Europe. But before launching an invasion, Germany needed control of the skies. This led to one of the most famous air battles in history, the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, began attacking British airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories. Their goal was to destroy the Royal Air Force, RAF, and gain air superiority. Outnumbered and under constant attack, RAF pilots fought bravely. Radar technology allowed Britain to detect incoming German aircraft early, giving pilots crucial time to respond. The battle soon expanded to include bombing raids on British cities, including London, in what became known as the Blitz. Night after night, bombs rained down on civilian neighborhoods. Homes burned, buildings collapsed, and thousands of civilians were killed. Yet British morale did not break. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill delivered powerful speeches that inspired the nation. One of his most famous lines captured the spirit of resistance. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Hitler's first major defeat. By October 1940, Germany failed to destroy the RAF. Heavy losses and strong resistance forced Hitler to postpone his planned invasion of Britain, known as Operation Sea Lion. For the first time, Nazi Germany had been stopped. The Battle of Britain marked Hitler's first major defeat of a war and proved that Germany was not invincible. The war expands. Although Britain survived, the war was far from over. Germany controlled most of Europe, and millions lived under brutal occupation. Resistance movements began to form, while Jewish persecution intensified under Nazi rule. At the same time, Hitler began planning an even larger and more dangerous campaign, an invasion of the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, tensions were rising in the Pacific, where Japan continued its expansion. The world was moving closer to total war. In Part 3, the conflict will expand dramatically as Hitler turns east, Japan strikes in the Pacific, and the war truly becomes global. By 1941, World War II had already devastated Europe, but the most violent phase of the conflict was still ahead. What began as a European war now spread across continents and oceans, pulling new nations into a struggle that would decide the fate of the world. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler turns east. On June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Over 3 million German soldiers, supported by tanks and aircraft, stormed across the Soviet border. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within months. At first, the German Blitzkrieg was devastatingly effective. Soviet armies were caught unprepared, entire divisions were surrounded, and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were captured. German forces advanced rapidly toward key cities such as Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. But the invasion was built on dangerous assumptions. Hitler underestimated the size of the Soviet Union, the resilience of its people, and the harshness of the Russian climate. As German troops pushed deeper into Soviet territory, their supply lines stretched dangerously thin. The Siege of Leningrad. One of the most horrific episodes of the war began in September 1941, when German forces surrounded the city of Leningrad. Instead of storming the city, Hitler ordered it to be starved into submission. The siege lasted nearly 900 days. Food supplies ran out, winter temperatures dropped far below freezing, and civilians suffered unimaginable hardship. People ate bread made from sawdust, boiled wallpaper for glue, and survived on tiny rations. Over 1 million civilians died from starvation, cold, and disease. Yet Leningrad never surrendered. Its survival became a symbol of Soviet endurance and sacrifice. The drive toward Moscow. As summer turned to autumn, German forces advanced toward Moscow. Victory seemed close. However, autumn rains turned roads into mud, slowing tanks and vehicles. Then winter arrived earlier than expected. German troops were poorly equipped for freezing temperatures. Weapons jammed, vehicles broke down, and soldiers suffered frostbite. Meanwhile, Soviet forces, accustomed to winter warfare, launched a powerful counteroffensive in December 1941. German armies were pushed back from Moscow. It was a stunning moment, the first major land defeat for Hitler's army. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Holocaust intensifies. As the war expanded, Nazi persecution of Jews escalated into systematic mass murder. Mobile killing units, known as Einsatzgruppen, followed German armies into Eastern Europe, executing Jews, Roma, and political opponents. By late 1941, Nazi leaders began implementing the final solution, a plan to exterminate Europe's Jewish population. Ghettos were established, families were deported, and death camps were constructed. The Holocaust became one of the darkest crimes in human history, resulting in the murder of 6 million Jews. Japan strikes the United States. While war raged in Europe, tensions in the Pacific reached a breaking point. Japan sought to dominate East Asia and the Pacific, but its ambitions were blocked by the United States, which imposed economic sanctions and oil embargoes. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Japanese aircraft bombed battleships and airfields, killing over 2,400 Americans and crippling much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack shocked the American public. The next day, the United States declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy soon declared war on the United States, turning the conflict into a truly global war. The early war in the Pacific. Following Pearl Harbor, Japan moved quickly. It captured Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and large parts of Southeast Asia. British and Allied forces suffered devastating defeats, and Japan appeared unstoppable. However, Japan's success would be short-lived. The United States began mobilizing its massive industrial power. Factories produced ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at an unprecedented rate. The balance of power was slowly shifting. Total war on the home front. World War II was not fought only on battlefields. Civilians played a crucial role in what became known as total war. Entire economies were transformed to support the war effort. Women entered factories in large numbers, producing weapons and machinery, while men fought overseas. Rationing limited food, fuel, and clothing. Cities were blacked out at night to avoid enemy bombers. Propaganda posters encouraged unity, sacrifice, and hatred of the enemy. The line between soldier and civilian blurred as bombing campaigns targeted cities and industrial centers. A world at war. By the end of 1941, the world was engulfed in conflict. Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific were all battlefields. Dozens of nations were involved, and millions were already dead. Yet this was still only the beginning. The coming years would bring battles of unprecedented scale, Stalingrad, Midway, Alamein, and turning points that would decide the war's outcome. The fate of nations now rested on industrial power, military strategy, and human endurance. In Part 4, the tide of war will begin to turn as the Allies fight back. Major battles change the balance of power, and hope slowly returns. By 1942, World War II had reached a level of destruction the world had never seen before. Entire cities lay in ruins, millions were dead, and nations were fighting not just for victory, but for survival. Yet this year would mark a crucial shift. For the first time, the Axis powers began to lose momentum, and the balance of the war slowly started to change. The Battle of Stalingrad. One of the most decisive battles in history began in the summer of 1942 in the Soviet city of Stalingrad. Adolf Hitler was obsessed with capturing the city, both for its strategic location on the Volga River and because it bore the name of his enemy, Joseph Stalin. German forces advanced into Stalingrad and fierce urban combat followed. Soldiers fought street by street, building by building, often at point-blank range. The city was reduced to rubble, yet Soviet troops refused to surrender. As winter approached, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive. They encircled the German Sixth Army, trapping over 250,000 Axis soldiers. Despite desperate conditions, starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant attacks, Hitler forbade retreat. In February 1943, the German army in Stalingrad surrendered. It was a catastrophic defeat for Nazi Germany and a psychological turning point. From this moment on, Germany would be fighting a defensive war in the East, the North African Campaign. While the Soviets fought in the East, the Allies were also gaining ground in North Africa. Control of North Africa was vital for access to Middle Eastern oil and Mediterranean shipping routes. German General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, initially achieved significant victories against British forces. However, the arrival of fresh Allied troops and better coordination changed the situation. In October 1942, British forces under General Bernard Montgomery defeated Rommel at the Second Battle of El Alamein. Soon after, American and British troops landed in Morocco and Algeria during Operation Torch. Caught between Allied forces from the East and West, Axis troops in North Africa surrendered in May 1943. This victory gave the Allies control of the Mediterranean and boosted morale across the Allied world. Turning points in the Pacific, Midway. In the Pacific, the turning point came in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Japanese forces planned to lure the U.S. Navy into a trap and destroy its remaining aircraft carriers. However, American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications and knew the plan in advance. When the battle began, U.S. aircraft launched a surprise attack that destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The loss was devastating for Japan. Experienced pilots and critical ships were gone forever. From this point onward, Japan would be on the defensive, slowly losing territory to Allied advances. The Allied advance in the Pacific. After Midway, the United States adopted a strategy known as island hopping. Instead of attacking every Japanese-held island, Allied forces targeted key strategic locations, bypassing heavily fortified positions. Brutal battles followed in places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and New Guinea. Fighting was intense, conditions were harsh, and casualties were high. The war in the Pacific was marked by close combat, jungle warfare, and fierce resistance. Despite the cost, the Allies steadily pushed closer to Japan. Strategic bombing and total war. As Allied strength grew, air power became increasingly important. Allied bombers carried out massive bombing campaigns against German and Japanese cities and industrial centers. In Europe, British and American aircraft targeted factories, railways, and oil refineries. Cities such as Hamburg and Dresden were devastated by firebombing raids. In the Pacific, American bombers attacked Japanese cities, causing widespread destruction and civilian casualties. These campaigns aimed to cripple the enemy's ability to fight, but they also raised moral questions that remain debated today. Italy falls. In 1943, the Allies turned their attention to southern Europe. After invading Sicily, Allied forces pushed into mainland Italy. The Italian population, exhausted by war, turned against their fascist leader. In July 1943, Benito Mussolini was removed from power and arrested. Italy later surrendered to the Allies. However, German forces quickly occupied much of Italy, turning it into another brutal battleground. Fighting in Italy was slow and costly, but it forced Germany to divert troops from other fronts, weakening its overall position. Hope returns. By the end of 1943, the momentum of the war had clearly shifted. The Axis powers were retreating on multiple fronts. Allied factories outproduced enemy industries, Allied armies grew stronger, and confidence spread among soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the war was far from over. Germany still controlled much of Europe, and Japan showed no sign of surrender. The final and most intense phase of the war was approaching. By 1944, World War II had entered its final and most decisive phase. The Axis powers were weakening on all fronts, while the Allies prepared massive offensives to end the conflict. What followed would reshape nations, redraw borders, and change world history forever. D-Day, the liberation of Western Europe. On June 6, 1944, the Allies launched the largest amphibious invasion in history, D-Day. Under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, over 150,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. The invasion began before dawn with airborne troops parachuting behind enemy lines to secure bridges and disrupt German defenses. As dawn broke, Allied soldiers stormed 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword, under heavy German fire. The fighting was brutal, especially at Omaha Beach, where casualties were severe. But by the end of the day, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. D-Day marked the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The advance toward Germany. Following Normandy, Allied forces pushed inland. Paris was liberated in August 1944, greeted by cheering crowds. German forces were retreating, but the fighting remained intense. In December 1944, Hitler launched a final major counteroffensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge. German troops attacked through the Ardennes forest, hoping to split Allied forces. Despite initial surprise, Allied soldiers held their ground under harsh winter conditions. By January 1945, the German offensive collapsed. It was Hitler's last gamble, and it failed. The fall of Nazi Germany. As Allied armies advanced from the west, Soviet forces pushed relentlessly from the east. Cities across Germany were reduced to rubble by bombing and artillery fire. In April 1945, Soviet troops entered Berlin. Street fighting was fierce as German defenses crumbled. On April 30, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 7, 1945, Germany officially surrendered. The war in Europe ended with Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, celebrated on May 8. After 6 years of unimaginable suffering, Europe was finally free from Nazi rule. The liberation of the camps. As Allied forces advanced, they discovered Nazi concentration and extermination camps. What they found shocked the world. Millions of Jews, along with Roma, disabled people, political prisoners, and others, had been murdered in gas chambers or died from starvation, forced labor, and disease. Survivors were skeletal, traumatized, and barely alive. The full horror of the Holocaust became undeniable. The Allies vowed that such crimes must never happen again. The final battles in the Pacific. While Europe celebrated victory, the war continued in the Pacific. American forces moved closer to Japan, fighting brutal battles at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, and civilian casualties were massive. These battles convinced American leaders that invading Japan's mainland would cost millions of lives. The atomic bomb. In an effort to end the war quickly, the United States made a fateful decision. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The destruction was instant and devastating. Entire cities were destroyed, and tens of thousands died immediately, with many more suffering from radiation sickness. On August 15, 1945, Japan announced its surrender. World War II was finally over. A changed world. World War II left over 60 million people dead, soldiers and civilians alike. Cities lay in ruins, economies were shattered, and entire populations were displaced. In the aftermath, the world sought a new path. The United Nations was created to prevent future global conflicts. War crimes trials were held in Nuremberg and Tokyo, bringing Nazi and Japanese leaders to justice. 2 superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cold War. Former empires weakened, and movements for independence grew across Asia and Africa. The legacy of World War II. World War II was not just a war of armies, it was a war of ideas. It tested humanity's capacity for cruelty, sacrifice, courage, and hope. The lessons of the war remain vital today. The dangers of hatred and unchecked power, the importance of standing against injustice, and the high cost of global conflict. The world that emerged after 1945 was forever changed, but shaped by the determination that such destruction should never happen again.